Buenas tardes. Good evening again. Thank you very much. And sorry very much for this delay in starting this session because we had some technical problems. Thank you for your patience and thank you very much for attending to a new edition of our World Economic Observatory. As I said before, I'm very happy today to introduce Richard Baldwin and Rafael Repullo to talk about tariffs, how they have shaken markets, and how they have tested the world ability to organize trade without the US leadership. Thank you, Professor Baldwin. Thank you, Professor Repullo. And now I give the floor to Rafael Repullo. Thank you again.
Okay, well, let's get started again. This is a really interesting session based on a book that was published a few months ago, and it is extremely interesting reading, which I did in one day, and there are many things in the book that I like, but it's better that I leave the floor to the author, that he will have a presentation, and after that we will have a dialogue between me and the other Rafa and the outside audience. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So if we pull up the slide, here we go. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share my ideas with this very important audience, very large audience, I'm hoping. And also that it'll be recorded on YouTube and stay up there so I can refer to it in social media, people can look at it. So as you heard, this is the book, The Great Trade Hack, that I wrote. That was in May 2025. And although that was only a few months ago, it seems like about 2 years ago. So much has happened so fast. So I write about this stuff every single Friday on LinkedIn in something called a column called Factful Friday. And so a lot of what I'll do today is talk about some of the things I've done beyond the book as well. So let me just dive straight into it. Question first is, what has Trump done? And I think it's important to make a very clear distinction between what Trump did in his first administration and what President Trump has done this year, in April in particular. I believe he started the post-US trade leadership era. On April 2nd, before April 2nd this year, the US was a steward of the world trading system. It was not perfect. The US had been starting to be hesitant as a leader, but it was clear that that leadership helped support the world trading system. On April 2nd, Donald Trump broke every promise that America had made to anyone on trade anywhere. With a single signature, he broke every single free trade agreement. He broke all the promises that the US had made over the last 80 years in the WTO and proceeded to pretend as if there were no rules. And what we have now is a system with no leaders. The US has essentially removed itself from the leadership without trying to reform the system. This was not an attempt to change the system to be a little bit more in the US favor. It was a hack on the system, essentially pretending the system no longer existed, and we're moving back to the law of the jungle where might makes right. Remember what you were doing on April 2nd, because your kids will read about it in history books, and the chapter will be called Post-American Trade Leadership Era. This transformation is here to stay. America won't be back for the foreseeable future, in my view. There is now a bipartisan consensus in DC that foreigners should be blamed for the problems of the American middle class and the US problems overall. The US economy is doing quite well as an aggregate, but many middle class people in the United States are suffering. And instead of trying to address that with social policy or education policy, the decision has been made, not explicitly, but there's been essentially an agreement to blame foreigners. And that's taking two forms. It's taking the form of blaming foreigners through trade by putting up big trade barriers and thinking that that will improve things. and by deporting foreigners who are in the United States through a very aggressive strategy of kicking out people from the US. Now, I'm saying this because I cannot imagine a president running in 2028 who says, an American president says, okay, no problem, we'll just go back to signing free trade agreements, forget about all that trade bashing stuff. No Democrat and certainly no Republican would run on a platform like that. So we can't just wait till Trump leaves. This is for the long term, foreseeable future in the US. So get used to it. We have a world trade system without a leader. Now, why did Trump do this? What Trump did on April 2nd, as I argued, is historic. It was extremely unusual. It's super important to understand that it has nothing to do with what he did in his first term. In his first term, he had problems with China in particular areas, and he put on tariffs in retaliation for what he viewed as Chinese unfair behavior. And all that followed US trade law. Almost all of it respected trade rules. That's not what he did now. My argument is that this is a populist channeling of middle-class pain. The US middle class is ailing since the globatic shocks of the 1990s. That is to say, from about 1990 on, there was a globalization shock that showed up to a large extent in the offshoring of manufactured goods. But there was also a robotic shock. So globotics is globalization and robotics put together. And it focused on the manufacturing sector. It led to a lot of loss of manufacturing jobs. And without a decent social policy to help them adjust, the middle class became the forgotten men and women and left behind. Traditional Democrats and Republicans failed to help. This was a long time ago. Traditional Republicans come in, Democrats come in, Republicans come in. Nothing changes, nothing improves for this middle class who's having problems financially, and there's many, many indications that they're just not doing well. Their sense of victimhood really took off during the global financial crisis when they saw the banks get bailed out and no bankers go to jail. But many of them lost their houses. For instance, when the auto sector companies almost went bankrupt, the government bailed out the auto companies, but not always the auto workers. So a sense of victimization that the elite was controlling things and getting rich on suffering the middle class, that's something that took over, that took root around that time. And Trump channeled that pain and victimhood into a political movement and framed tariffs and deportations as the key pain relievers. And his political base believed, as it's clear economically that these things are not working, as I'll show you some slides later on. But as Bill Clinton said long ago, when people aren't certain, they prefer somebody who's strong and wrong to somebody who's weak and right. And Donald Trump is strong. I think he's wrong as well. But the main thing is that his trade policy is driven by a focus on his political base. That's why he's following what I call, and this is probably the main contribution of the book, the grievance doctrine. So let me put this in cartoons. The grievance doctrine is a myth that America played by the rules. Here's America shaking hands, and the foreigners are over there with knives behind their back. And America got played. America was humiliated. Workers were humiliated. They lost jobs. With Donald Trump, this grievance mandate comes with a mandate to stop what's been going on, the victimization of American middle class, to stop the steal, and now it's payback time. Retribution is what Donald Trump's trade policy is about. The bill has to be paid. Now that sounds crazy. Economists have trouble listening to that and thinking, yeah, it's that. Most of economists are thinking about US trade policy as trade policy traditionally understood. And I think that's a big mistake. Let me make that argument in a different way. The grievance doctrine. Trump's policy is economically incoherent, but emotionally coherent. My assertion is you cannot understand US trade policy by thinking of it as traditional trade policy. When you listen to economists talking about trade, but President Trump's trade policy, you hear words like erratic, self-defeating, chaotic, crazy. And in any case, he keeps changing it all the time. But if you view that trade policy as a flare to show the forgotten men and women that finally the American president is standing up for them, you'll understand that it all makes sense. And it doesn't actually have to be economically coherent. It just has to rally the base. Now, this is not traditional trade policy. I want to make that argument another way. When you look at what President Trump said when he announced the tariffs on April 2nd, it sounds like he's talking about foreign trade policy as war crimes against America. Now, many people listen to these words, and many economists just ignore those words because it didn't sound like trade policy. It sounded like some sort of marketing. But listen to the words, and they're very strong words, but listen to them. And if you understand that that's what he's thinking about trade policy, you'll see it in a different way. So let me quote President Trump. For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friends and foe alike. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for many years, but it's not going to happen anymore. Now, I'm not making up those words. Those are the words he used in the Rose Garden when he announced the tariffs. And if you look over here, it started with a mathematically clear formulation linking each country's trade policy to their bilateral surplus with the United States. But over the months that followed, due to all sorts of things, this red line is how the tariffs announcement went. It was like a kite in a storm, no sense or sensibility. The threatened tariffs were changed from April 2nd without notice, without rhyme or reason. Then there were climb downs. There were deadlines that were delayed. In no way did that resemble trade policy as traditionally done. Moreover, there were no studies quantifying the effect. There was no KPIs. It wasn't like we want to bring back so many factory jobs by 2027, or we want to improve the trade deficit by this much by, say, next year. There was no goals like that, which are very convenient because President Trump can declare victory no matter what happens. Now, I want to go do this one more time. I want to proceed with this one more. One way to think about this is economists are scoring Trump's golf game as if it were a tennis match. What I mean to say here is when you think about what Trump is doing, most of the economists are thinking it's a tennis game, and they think it's crazy that it hasn't even hit the ball over the net. Trump takes a drive, and the economists go, well, that's crazy. That's going to actually make things worse. And that's true. But Trump isn't playing tennis. He's playing golf. And that's what this grievance doctrine is. Okay, enough on that. But I think that's one of my main points, that you got to think about it differently. The second point is China has fully countered Trumpian tariffs with export controls. So that came up almost immediately. They did it on April 4th, but many people hadn't noticed it until much later. In fact, even this week and last week, a lot of people cottoned on to it, but that's really been fully done. Let me explain a second here. Chinese export controls are precision weapons. Trumpian tariffs are like carpet bombing. Now, I wrote about this in June 20th, if you can see on my LinkedIn column, Asymmetric Geopolitical Warfare, Who Wins, if you want to see the argument in more detail. But let me just summarize a few things here. China has stalemated Trump with export controls. China launched export controls on the 4th of April that were years in the planning. What it means is that every company needs a permit to export goods, which include rare earths in them, for any use. And those permits have to tell the Chinese government what they're going to be used for, and they're not allowed to be exported if they're going to be used for weapons in particular. Otherwise, it will probably go through, but there's this idea of delay, and certainly in the beginning, there were a lot of delays. Especially important were controls on rare earth magnets. Now, these things, you can look them up on ChatGPT if you want. These are needed for high-performance electric motors which are needed in most advanced manufactured goods, including particular cars, and military equipment, including all the precision weapons that the US makes. Now, China actually completely dominates this industry. There's like 4 stages. In mining, China has about 70%. Then you have to separate them. There's a lot of dirt and only very little rare earths. China dominates at about 85%. They control of that. Then you have to refine it into metals. They control even more of that. And then when you make it into magnets, they control about 95% of all these magnets, which are used in almost all manufacturing goods. So this is really quite a stranglehold on the whole world. And they are not applied just to the US. They're applied to the entire world, in part to make them WTO compliant. So the Chinese thought about this very carefully and went through a whole series of steps so it would be effective. Now, just to give you an example, if you remember when Trump announced the tariffs on April 2nd, China retaliated almost immediately. Then Trump retaliated against China. Then China retaliated. And eventually, they got to tariffs up to about 145%. In fact, during that time, tariffs on both sides were raised by 125%. And that started causing real pain inside the United States because a large share of the imported intermediates that are used in American manufacturing, among other things, are imported from China. And that kind of 145% just shut down the trade. So the US was pretty desperate to negotiate those down in April. And what happened when they met in London was the US lowered its tariffs by 115 percentage points, and China lowered its tariffs by 115 percentage points. This is a detail in a LinkedIn post. Now, what that meant is that the US removed all of its April 2nd tariffs in exchange for nothing from China except China removing its retaliation. And it was spun out like it was some sort of asymmetric deal, but the US went up 125 and went down 115, and China went up 125 and went down 115. So completely backed them down. The 10% China got is what was tariff applied to people who didn't have a deficit with the US, but China has a big one. Okay, next point. World trade is now weaponized globally. Weaponized trade policy actions and trade policy threats. So the US tariffs are well understood, are basically applied to everybody in the whole world. And its rule breaking is here to stay, in my view, because I don't think a Democrat could win when the consensus in Washington is that foreigners are to blame for the US problems. The Chinese export controls are also here to stay, I believe, because although they are WTO compliant and they don't need to use them, they're a precision weapon that allow them to influence lots of things. They may even spill over into more geostrategic things. The EU is adopting anti-coercion tools and may start using them. Many countries are adopting national security investment screening, and surely more is to come. So we are now in a thoroughly weaponized world on trade. But I'm going to argue that the US is likely to back down somewhat. This is in a prediction I made in a post in 12th of September. So Trumpian tariffs, the promise. The promise will be delivering for the American people. And here you have one of the workers at this announcement on April 2nd saying that he thinks it's going to be fantastic and it's all the jobs are going to come. So let's see what actually happened. The reality was, while Wall Street boomed, there was a big drop down in the markets, but now it's completely recovered and is continuing to boom. Main Street pays more. So when the prices started to go up and journalists asked Trump about what was going on, he said, well, maybe children will have to pay $2 more and have not get $2 instead of $30. So he's saying Main Street's going to pay more even though Wall Street's booming. That is not the original promise. The original promise, this was trade policy for Main Street, not Wall Street, but it turned out the other way. Here's some facts. The reality. The cost of goods is rising. This is the CPI, and the red is the goods component of CPI, and you can see it's been rising. The service is compensated somewhat by services, and there's a lot of data now, much more direct data of the cost of imported goods, and they're rising. They're not rising like enormously, but if you were on the edge living paycheck to paycheck, as more than half of Americans are, even 4 or 5% more for your goods is a real problem at the end of the month. Moreover, blue-collar job creation is falling. This is since Trump took office, the blue line going down, blue-collar job creation is going. So this is not creating jobs, and it's raising the cost of living in this space. Moreover, President Trump is seeing his approval falling across all categories, but especially among young voters. I would draw your attention to the right of the screen here. This is his approval among voters who voted for him in 2024. Now, of course, those numbers are very high, and they stay very high in the old over 65. But among the young, they've started to fall, especially since he started putting on the tariffs, because a lot of them are seeing no job creation and higher costs of living. So now to end, I want to say that the world is transiting to an unknown trade system. The US is undermining its hard and soft power. China and large emerging economies are gaining status and power regionally. So my conjectures are, first, there'll be no clear global trade leader, but the US economy will become more closed, and new coalitions will form and expand and gain in importance, such as the Comprehensive Partnership of Trans-Pacific Trade, which is called CPTPP. It's in the Pacific mostly, although the UK just joined it. ASEAN and RCEP, you can see the agreements that were already signed this agreement. And here on the right, you'll see the chart that shows the US share of world exports has fallen, which means it's closing off on the export side. And of course, on the import side, its share of world imports are going down because of the tariffs. So in essence, the US is becoming a more closed economy, but the rest of the world has moved on. So this orange line here is going back to the January 2023. The imports of the US were going up more or less. They spiked right when President Trump was elected because people were afraid of the tariffs and they wanted to get the imports before. But since the tariffs were imposed, exports are falling. But the rest of the world exports are rising. So this is exports of the rest of the world to the rest of the world are rising. Exports of the US are falling. So what's next? This is some thinking if you want to see it in detail. I posted a thing, how does a trade war end, on June 29th. So the idea here in the optimistic scenario is that Trump tacos, in other words, he chickens out on some tariffs this winter to protect his base before the midterm elections. I think in particular, he'll remove the fentanyl tariffs. China manages to prevent the US from spreading anti-China provisions in its trade deals, and the US drifts towards isolation while the rest of the world moves on. In my book, I call that the reglobalization without America, led by mega regional agreements that may then form together. Okay, pessimistic serial, let's talk about it. I just want to end there and listen to your questions and comments, please. Thank you. I'll stop right there. Stop. How do I stop sharing?
Oh, okay. Right. So I will. Okay. Now let me start with a question that is related to what you said about this fall in approval ratings of Trump. Now, the tariffs will not fix the trade deficit, and this is very well argued in the book. They will not revive manufacturing, and they will not help the middle class. So, I mean, they are a complete failure from the perspective of the goals that they were set to achieve, right? Now, in the book, you argue that despite this failure, the tariffs, I mean, this is not a policy that will be reversed. I mean, typically, when you think about policies that don't work, then at some point they are reversed, and then you think about, well, going back to the old ways, I mean, or try something else. But what you say in the book is that precisely because they fail economically, maybe succeed politically, then they will continue in place. So how can you explain this sort of puzzle?
Sure. So the real solution to U.S. Problems, U.S. middle class problems, and by the way, this globotic shock, globalization and robotics, hit every advanced economy in the whole world, and there is something of a backlash and anger among the middle class in all the advanced economies. You've seen it in different ways. Brexit, for example, was a classic example of it in England. England was also had very relatively modest social policy. Now, the trouble is, in order to have a social policy, say like Canada does, with universal health care or retraining or active labor market policies, you would have to have higher taxes and bigger government. And in the US, that's like completely off the agenda. Since Reagan, basically, taxes have been falling, the government's been shrinking apart from the debt payment. But that's really off the tendency. So they can't go back there. So trade policy will continue to be the pain reliever, even though it's not effective. Now you can say, how can people put up with that? Well, the thing is, when people are angry, they're not analytic. So they may figure out that the prices are going up, and as long as Trump doesn't do it too much, he removes some of the tariffs. He's already exempted half of imports from this, so the impact has not been as big as it is. I think it will continue, and it's a convenient scapegoat. Now, if you want an analogy, Brexit happened in 2016. It's widely accepted that it's ruined a lot of manufacturing, a big loss of financial jobs, and yet it's almost impossible for somebody to even say, let's reverse it. The current Labour government is starting to soften it a little bit, but the fact that it was a failure and almost everybody accepts that it's a failure doesn't mean it's going to be reversed. So that's how I'm viewing about Trumpian tariffs.
Okay, well, that's pretty clear argument, especially with the Brexit analogy. Now, you've led the CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, for a number of years, and you've been working on these economic policy issues for 40 plus years. Now, we used to think about economists sort of pushing for evidence-based policy making. And it is pretty shocking for people like us that have been sort of somewhat, especially you, involved in this type of pushing the idea that you need to think about what's the objectives to be achieved, what are the tools, what are the way in which we can assess and evaluate ex ante and expose different policies. That now, I mean, overnight, kind of everything is being thrown out of the window, really. I mean, what is left of all these efforts that you and many people have been doing over the last few years? How could it happen? I mean, this is pretty shocking, right?
Well, so I think what it is that the anger of the American middle class just got so big, and it's with Bush, with Reagan, with Bush, it really started with the shocks. Really came big with Obama, and then there was some help to the middle class, but not that much because it would have required higher taxes. So people got really, really angry, and it was a populist uprising. Now, populism isn't about analysis. It's not, the people who are angry, they're not doing a careful study of what's going to help them. They just want action. And we've seen this many times. Populists come up and they do crazy things. Frequently, they're economically illiterate. But that's not what the people want. They don't want a careful analysis. So what we get instead, and you may enjoy this, Rafael, instead of evidence-based policy making, we get policy-based evidence making. So in fact, they make up the facts. They say that this is true. When you listen to Donald Trump talk about his trade policy, often in the same sentence, he contradicts himself. And now in the world of social media, the MAGA social media will take the second part of the sentence where he said one thing, and the mainstream media will take the first part of the sentence of the other. So people are really not listening to the same discussion of what's going on and who's to blame. So that's what I think has happened, is that there's been an undermining of the value of the truth that's been allowed to propagate because of the fracturing of the information space.
Yeah. Well, I guess that there may be some hopes in other parts of the world. And I would like to come to Europe. Europe means EU plus UK and maybe Switzerland. I mean,
Yeah.
there was an article in today's La Vanguardia, which is one of the leading Spanish newspapers, by Andreu Mascolell. And he was saying that it's not enough the yes we can of Obama in Europe. We should have the yes we want. And I would like you to sort of comment on what can Europe do in the face of this sort of chaotic administration on many fronts, not just the trade front.
Sure. Okay. Well, so I think Europe has a super important role to play in this whole thing. So my optimistic scenario is the U.S., just to remember, only accounts for about 15% of world trade. The other 85% is accounted for other countries. So as long as this idea of break all the rules, do whatever you want, pretend might makes right, as long as that doesn't spread to the other 85%, the world trading system will survive and the US will just get more closed. That's my view. Now, the EU is actually the largest trader in the world. If you count the internal trade and the external trade, it's almost a third. And so if EU continues to obey the rules, and the EU continues to obey the rules, and the EU is just baked in to be legalistic and following rules. That's the way the whole thing is set up. It's basically impossible for the European Union to consciously break WTO rules. It's just not set up that way. And so that respect for the rules, at least as to the letter of the rules, will help a lot to keep things going. Moreover, this shock, which is essentially undermined trust of many Europeans in the US, both on the security front and on the economic front, increasingly on the cultural front as well, that is bringing Europe together and helping a lot. And I think it will strengthen it. So I don't think that we're going to see EU aligning with China against the US, but as long as the EU stays free and sensible, that's a huge contribution. Main thing is Europe has to become more self-reliant in many ways, but especially security ways. I think, for instance, the EU has the leverage to stop the US from doing what it is in the same way China does, because the US relies a lot on US industrial inputs, but they can't because of the security guarantee. So they're afraid that if they retaliate, I think very wisely, if they retaliated fiercely, Trump might have retaliated by, for instance, withdrawing from NATO or not supporting Ukraine. So if the EU really wants to be independent, they're going to also have to become more self-reliant in terms of national defense. So I think what we have to realize is now we're living in a dangerous world. For many years, when us, Rafa, the two Rafas and me, we grew up in a world where things were getting safer, more rational, and it made sense that, for instance, the United States would make none of the most advanced chips in the United States. It made none of its 5G equipment. And that seemed like a sensible thing to do because the world was safe. Now the world's dangerous. And I think we have to rethink this idea of interdependence, not fully. I mean, of course, it's super important, but it's a different attitude that I think we have to have. And European integration and European cohesion, I think, is an important way of keeping the world sensible, but in a world where trade is not as safe as it was before. Sorry it took so long to say that.
Let me ask a final question before I leave the floor to the other Rafa for his questions and questions from the audience. Now, why has it been so difficult with Canada? After all, Trump and Carney seem to get along well, apparently, and so Canada is sort of kind of an exception, really, in terms of this agreement. So why is it?
Yeah, well, so you have to remember that most of it's pro forma with Canada. So Canada has a 35% headline tariff, but about 80% of exports from Canada to the US are exempted because energy exports are exempted, some of the raw materials are exempted, and everything that's USMCA compliant is exempted because the US cannot make cars or planes or anything without Canadian parts. And originally, Trump on April 2nd said, or actually started in March with high tariffs. And the next day, all the American manufacturers called him up and says, by the way, Donald, we cannot make cars without Canadian parts, and we can't pay 35. So the next day, he exempted it. And so when he goes after Carney, it's really performative. It's exactly his trade policy. It's a grievance. It makes him feel good. It makes the MAGA base think he's standing up for, but it's actually not affecting things that much. Now, why Canada? Canada actually had the gall to retaliate in March against these tariffs. And that bothered him a lot. And he started talking about it as a 51st state. And the other thing you got to remember about Canadians is it's a little bit like they have a love-hate relationship with the U.S. They have this idea of a sort of inferiority, a chip on the shoulder kind of thing. And so when the U.S. starts acting like that, the Canadians get shirty about it, and no Canadian politician could be as compliant as many other countries were, because it would destroy them domestically. So I think their reaction of the Canadians was very emotional against the U.S., and Donald Trump is not backing down. But the important thing is that it doesn't actually have much economic implication, because most of the exports are exempted.
Okay, well, Rafa, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Rafa. Well, first, Richard, congratulations for your work. This has been an amazing presentation. You propose in your book this reglobalization without America. However, this coalition will lack the singular economic weight of a leader, as was the United States in the past. Okay. Do you think that the world will inevitably fragment without a dominant rule-based anchor, as was the United States in the past? And let me here put together another question that has been made by Diego Crescente. Diego is the director of the Escuela de Organización Industrial, and is related to this question and to a previous question by Rafa. What concrete steps should the European Union take to fill the vacuum and prevent global trade from becoming a casualty of American domestic politics?
Okay, so let me go with two. So I don't think it's going to fragment. In particular, the WTO rules are being respected by the other countries who represent 85% of world trade. This idea of grievance doctrine has not spread. Although plenty of countries have grievances about trade, most of the rest of the countries of the world think the global trading system that's based on rules has been good for them, and they're continuing to support them in some way or another. Now, the way it actually will go forward is, I think, through mega regional agreements, like the RCEP in Asia or CPTPP in Asia. And I think the European Union can concretely start to cooperate with some of the other larger free trade agreements. The EU is by far the largest, but by cooperating and liberalizing with other agreements, who knows, maybe even joining CPTPP, for example, could be a step towards creating a world system where there are rules and there is discipline, but it avoids some of the problems of the WTO, but doesn't fall into the trap of the 1930s of sort of endless retaliation for retaliation. So that's my concrete step. Defend the rules by obeying the rules. That's the first thing to do, and the EU is doing that. And the second is look around for liberalization with other large regional trade agreements that will help liberalize the world. And as you saw on my slide, actually, exports of the rest of the world to the rest of the world are growing. And even though US exports are shrinking. So I think in some sense, we already have hints that this is kind of working, and that continued liberalization, I think, will help.
Thank you, Richard. I have another question. And if the United States continues on its current path to incompetence and opportunistic control, but at the same time, we have that China continues with this patient, strategic, and state-supported reindustrialization path. Which system do you think is more likely to be more stable and resilient, and and to succeed in the future. For example, in 2040.
Right. Okay. So in the book, I talk about this as a systems clash. So I think, China is rising. China is now the largest larger than the next 9 countries put together. China is a manufacturing superpower. And that rise was very rapid. And that hurt the US in some sense, at least the middle class. And that situation in history where there's a dominant power and a rising power, there's often conflicts between them. But this isn't a conflict over anything particular. It's really a system clash. You have state-led capitalism, where they have 5-year plans. The government integrates exchange policy, industrial policy, and trade policy into a package which has led to, for example, dominance of world electric vehicles in a very short time, and an emergence of increasingly advanced semiconductors in a very short time. So I think at least in terms of industrialization, the Chinese system is working very well. The problem with it is, I believe, and I've written this on the Factful Friday as well, that they're making a mistake by focusing only on manufacturing. It is a fact that the good jobs in the 21st century are in services, high-end services. And the US is making the same problem, but you'd never see anybody in the Trump administration hoping their kids work in a factory. They're all trying to get high-end service jobs. And ultimately, there's about 8% of the workforce in the US working in factories. And all this noise is about factories. China is much higher, but they still have a manufacturing mania. And I think that's a problem in the long run. They're going to have to move more into services. So which one is more resilient? Certainly in the short run, the Chinese system is working well and moving into advanced technology, and I think that will continue. The US is a very resilient system. It's booming, but not in manufacturing, in services. The US runs a surplus in services, has a comparative advantage, and that's not challenged by anybody. So it's a funny thing that I think people are overemphasizing manufacturing and therefore making category mistakes in terms of development strategies, but I don't see either of them sort of falling down soon.
Can I make a comment on this? In the book, you make statement on the policy retreat, how fast it was done in April, and following these Liberation Day tariffs. And you write here, when one side of a negotiation is in a rush to get a deal, the other side should leverage the rush to get a better deal. Now, this, I would say the other side will leverage the rush to get a better deal. And this reminds me of a literature that I knew very well many years ago, the non-cooperative bargaining theory, the Rubinstein model of alternating offers. In that model, the final outcome of the Nash bargaining depends on discount factors. And if one side is patient, it will get a lot of the surplus of the negotiation. And I think that this is probably something that is happening here, that one side is long-term, patient, the other side needs to get a deal, and therefore is in a weak bargaining position according to these type of insights. So I don't know if you...
I agree with that totally. I think we'll see it this week. I think the US-China deal will reflect the fact that Donald Trump is facing an election just about a year from now, of midterm elections, and all the empirical literature shows that inflation about a year in advance, or at least 6 months in advance, makes a huge impact on voting, and also the state of the economy. And the U.S. is not the U.S. is somewhat fragile. Another few big shocks could actually lead to a recession, which would mean a disaster for the midterm. So I think it's very important for the president to remove some of the cost of living pressure. And whereas President Xi, he's president for life. He's not in a big hurry. So I think that's where we're going. Also, I think even with the EU, you saw it with lots of countries, they slow walked Trump with all the trade negotiations. And even now, they weren't actual negotiations. I mean, there were negotiations, but there was no agreements. There was just nothing written down. And now they're very slow, what's actually true, that. And I think people are trying to wait out the United States, and the U.S. is going to be in more of a hurry. So it's an insightful thing you said, Raphael. I think that's why one of the reasons these so-called trade agreements look so strange. As Alan Beatty from the Financial Times says, they're not worth the handshake that they're written on.
Richard, given that you are a world-leading expert on international trade, and given your analysis in your book that protectionism has been a policy placebo, then what policies could be successfully implemented to address the middle class problems in a way that truly removes the political appeal of tariffs that we have seen in the United States?
Yeah, well, I think if the US adopted a Canadian-like social policy, that would help a lot. And especially, I think if the US adopted an active labor market policy where these left behind people were actively taken care of, retrained, relocation, or whatever's necessary, a little bit like they do in Denmark. The government promises if you lose your job, they'll do whatever they need to get you a new job, and people trust them. And as a consequence, the Danes are able to accept all sorts of shocks and movements. So I think a social policy, at least on the level of Canada, would be the solution. But that would require higher taxes and a bigger government. And therefore, I think it's politically impossible. So we may have to go through another big transformation, another big shock, political shock, in order to get to the point where it's fixed. Or maybe it will never get fixed. And it will just be a very unequal society, and the false narrative will be what the solution is.
You mentioned the potential rise in inflation. Now, let me ask you something which is not really related to trade. But you mentioned the sort of the deportation of foreigners and the slow movement of immigration. Now, if you reduce the labor supply, then at some point wages are going to increase, right? And are we seeing any signs of wage inflation that at a later stage will translate into price inflation?
I couldn't answer the facts, so I couldn't answer that directly with the facts. But what I can say is, for instance, the unemployment rate is flat, but job creation is down. And some people are arguing that the people are being removed from the labor force and the jobs are not being created. And if that's keeping the unemployment rate stable, but that it's hiding a weakness in the market. So I don't have the wage inflation data.
Well, I can add something here, okay, because we have some evidence, and at this moment, wage inflation is at the same level as in the United States and in the Eurozone. Okay, it's relatively low. Okay, but probably this is reflecting, as you said, that at the same time that we have this low growth of labor supply, we have a low growth of labor demand, and they are compensating together. But in any case, I think that because inventories in the first half of this year has been accumulated in the United States in expectation of this tariffs increase, I think that it will take time, probably until the beginning of next year. We are not going to see this pass through from tariffs to CPI inflation in the United States. Okay, it's going to be gradual.
Thank you. That's an important comment, Rafa. Let me just add two things to it. One, the U.S. is quite a closed economy. Imports only account for about 10% of GDP, something like that. So only a very narrow part of the CPI is affected directly by tariffs. I think 60% of it's services, and services aren't affected by tariffs. The second thing, so no matter what, you multiply even a fairly large increase in import prices times its weight in the CPI, it's not going to show up in the CPI. But nevertheless, Trump's base cares about it because it'll show up in frequently purchased items in Walmart and Amazon. We saw this with the conversion to the euro. that people focused on frequently bought goods, and those prices rose more. So there wasn't an inflation surge, but people thought there was an inflation surge because they're focusing on different goods. The second point is that a lot of the slow pass-through of the tariffs was because for up until July and mostly August, you had 45% tariff on China, more or less, because they were still there from the first Trump administration, but 10% on all the rivals. So Vietnam, Malaysia, Bangladesh, India, they all had 10%. Now those countries all have 20, 30%. So the Chinese are going to be able to pass through much more of the tariffs to their goods. So I think we'll see an acceleration of the pass-through. The second point on that acceleration is up until really July or August, the tariffs were going up and down like this. You had absolutely no idea where they're going to land. So why would you pass through the prices until then? But now there's all these executive orders setting them in. Switzerland, we have 35%, Europe has 15%, but that seems like it's going to stay there for a while. So companies will, I think, start passing it through more. So I agree with you totally that we'll see it in the end of this year or maybe early next year. We'll see much more pass through of the tariffs.
I have another question, and it's the following. Well, how do tariffs and trade tensions complicate this cooperation on non-trade security issues, such as the strategic containment of Russia here in Europe?
Yeah, so Europe decided not to retaliate, and I think I wrote a column saying that they could retaliate, but they shouldn't, exactly because of that. And they didn't. It wasn't because they listened to me. It was just because it's pretty obvious that if you have to decide between, a lower tariff on auto exports and then having, Russian tanks approach the border of the EU, they went with the foreign affairs, so the national security stuff. And the same thing is happening in Japan. Japan is, to a certain extent, beholden to the US on security. And that's a power that the US has that China doesn't have. And I think you can't overcome it. So it complicates it enormously. But on the other hand, for example, it forced Europe to increase their spending on NATO. And it forced Japan to greatly increase their spending. So in some sense, it's being dealt with a different tool, and I don't know whether the U.S. forced it or finally Europe realized that they needed a national defense as well. But the spending is up, and I think that has helped a lot with the cooperation with the U.S.
We have another question from the audience, and is the following. If the United States has turned trade policy into a weapon, an economic weapon, it is time for Europe to stop waiting and start leading. I think that here we have very, very good proposals, like the two reports like last year by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta. And I think that all of us are claiming about Europe start leading, and solving the structural problems that we have.
Yeah, well, as Monet said so many decades ago, l'Europe se fait à la crise. Europe makes itself during the crisis, and this is a crisis, both on the defense side and on the trade side. And I think it is a wake-up call that helps. The trouble is it's difficult for Europe to act because it's not just one person or not just one country. It's a very difficult thing to move forward. For instance, if you look at the Draghi report, it's not that different than the Delors white paper on competitiveness couple decades ago. And this idea that Europe has to get its single market together in order to, back then it was to meet the competition, economic competition from the United States and Japan. Now it's to meet the economic competition from China. But it's still the same things, and I think Europe is moving in that direction. But it's really it's like a difficult thing to move. It's like herding cats. So actually, I think it's really difficult for Europe to lead on anything, except regulation. There they can do it. But that's I think it's most important that Europe gets their house in order, starts to replace the U.S. market with more liberalization with other regions, and also completing the internal liberalization. So I agree with all that stuff in the Draghi report. Especially the capital market would be great. But these are things we've been hearing literally. They used to call it the 1992 program, if you remember, the single market. And we are a long way from 1992, and we're a long way from the single market. So
more than 30 years.
Yeah.
Well, Rafa, I don't know if
I think
you want to add something, but let me thank Richard and Rafa Repullo for being here with us. And thank you very much. It has been a real pleasure. And the topic is very, very relevant. Probably one of the most relevant that we had in the last couple of years. And thank you again. And
thank you for letting me share my thoughts with this big audience. Thank you.
I hope that we can meet again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.